Welcome to Adult Sleep Stories, where your day ends and your dreams begin. Tonight, let go of the noise, slow your breath, and follow the sound of my voice into a world beyond the ordinary. This is your time to unwind, drift deeply, and dream wildly. Let's begin. Take a deep breath and let it go. Tonight's story is a quiet journey into the forest and into the soul of a woman learning how to live again. The forest remembers you, follows Lena, a woman walking through grief after the loss of her mother, with nothing but a pack on her back and silence in her chest. She sets out alone on the Lake Superior hiking trail, seeking space, solitude, and something she can't quite name. She doesn't expect to meet anyone. She certainly doesn't expect to meet him. A stranger, a fellow hiker, and in one fleeting, magnetic moment, their paths cross and something ancient stirs. This is a story about healing, nature, and the kind of love that doesn't need time to be real. It's about the unspoken wisdom of the wilderness and the way soulmates sometimes arrive not to stay but to awaken us. So settle in, let the hush of the forest cradle you, and drift into a world where the pines remember, the lake listens, and love lingers in the silence. Now let's begin. I never meant to become someone who ran toward the wilderness. I was raised in Edina, where the sidewalks are manicured and the lawns get fertilized before the snow even finishes melting, where people smile politely in the grocery store aisles, and grief is something that you carry quietly, preferably in designer sunglasses. My mother died in February of breast cancer, the kind that comes back even after they tell you it's gone. The kind that makes you brave for a while and then tired for a very long time. She fought with grace. If grace means never complaining and still remembering everyone's birthdays. I watched her vanish by inches. First her hair, then her voice, then the light behind her eyes. And I was her only child and her caregiver, her advocate and her decision maker. And then I was no one, or at least I didn't know who I was anymore without her. After the funeral, people kept dropping off casseroles and Tupperware that I never returned. They sent cards with watercolor flowers and embossed doves. They said things like, "You were so strong," and "She was lucky to have you." But all I heard was, "It's over now. Time to move on." The problem was, I didn't know what moving on looked like. I had no partner to lean on. Jeff and I had split 6 months before Mom's diagnosis came back. When she first found the lump again, he said he wasn't built for long-term illness and that I was becoming emotionally unavailable. He wanted lightness. I wanted someone who didn't flinch when I cried on the kitchen floor. So no, I didn't move on. I froze in place. I went to work at the architecture firm and came home to the house that smelled like lemon cleaner and loss. I stood in her room some nights just to breathe in the faint trace of lavender hand cream on her pillowcase. I didn't delete her contact from my phone. One night in mid-June, I came across a link about the Lake Superior hiking trail. I don't remember what I had been searching for. Something like how to feel alive again or grief retreats in nature. The article showed photos of pine-lined ridges and glacial streams, the kind of untouched land that made you ache with how long it had existed without you. I don't know why I did it, really, but I opened a new browser tab and ordered a backpack, hiking boots, and a lightweight tent. I booked a week off of work and texted my boss that I was going on a personal healing retreat. I left it vague. What I meant was, I need to walk so far away from this version of myself that I forget how to get back. The morning I left Edina was humid and pale. The sky is still deciding whether to be gray or gold. I slid into my old CRV with a duffel bag of trail food, a brand new hiking GPS, and a paperback I knew I wouldn't read. I had no solid itinerary, just a rough plan to park near Gooseberry Falls and hike north for a few days alone. I didn't tell anyone except for my neighbor, Miss Loring, who promised to water the geraniums on the porch. She gave me a tin of lemon drops and a half-worried hug. "You'll find something out there," she said as I backed down the driveway, "even if it's just yourself." The first few hours of driving felt surreal. I passed Duluth and kept going, watching the city sprawl give way to quiet. The trees grew taller. The lake appeared beside the road like a sleeping giant. By the time I parked near the trailhead, my hands were trembling. Not from fear exactly, from anticipation maybe, from the dizzying sense that I was about to unearth something buried under the noise of my old life. I laced up my boots and slung the pack over my shoulders. It was heavier than I expected. I stood for a long moment at the beginning of the trail, where a wooden sign welcomed hikers with carved lettering, Lake Superior Hiking Trail, northbound. The forest ahead looked infinite. The first mile was a trial in humility. I hadn't anticipated how steep the inclines would be, or how my thighs would burn carrying 35 pounds of gear. My breath came hard and shallow. Sweat gathered along my spine. My new boots rubbed at my ankles with the subtle menace of an oncoming blister. But something else stirred too, something quiet and reverent. The trees were impossibly tall. Ferns crowded the path in places. Sunlight sifted through the leaves in narrow, holy columns. The birds sang with no concern for my presence. It had felt like I stepped into another dimension, one where time moved slower and the air carried memory. I hiked until my body insisted I stop. I found a small, flat clearing and pitched my tent near the base of a large pine. My fingers were clumsy with the poles. I cursed under my breath. But when it was up and I crawled inside to lay on my back with the mesh above me, I felt something close to peace. That night, I heated a pouch of dehydrated lentil stew and listened to the wind move through the forest canopy. There were no city sounds, no sirens, no engines, no muffled TVs behind drywall. Just me and the trees that have been alive longer than I had. I fell asleep to the distant roll of thunder over the lake and dreamed of my mother's hands, holding mine in a memory that hadn't happened. On the second day, I found my rhythm. There was something about walking for hours that soothed the most frantic parts of my mind. The pain in my body dulled to background noise. I adjusted the straps of my pack and began to see the landscape instead of just surviving it. I passed through birch groves and climbed over rocky outcrops with views of the glittering water far below. At one point, I stopped at a wooden overlook and let out a shaky breath. The lake looked endless, cerulean and silver, just alive. I thought about how many people had stood here before me, and how many had come to this land carrying the weight of grief or heartbreak or uncertainty. And I thought, maybe the trees remember. Maybe the land listens. By the third day, I stopped trying to check my phone. There was no signal, of course, but more than that, I didn't need it. My eternal clock synced to the light. I woke with the birds and walked until the shadows grew long. I've refilled my water bottle in cold creeks and cooked by the dim blue flame of my tiny stove. And inside me, something began to shift. Not all at once, but in gentle, imperceptible ways. I started talking to my mother aloud, just a little, in the quiet of the trees. Sometimes I asked questions. Sometimes I just told her what I saw. A red squirrel darting across the path, a hawk circling above, the way the moss looked like velvet on the rocks. She would have loved this. She used to take me camping when I was small, before she got sick. We'd roast marshmallows and look for constellations. She used to say, everything makes more sense in the woods. Maybe that's why I came here, to feel her again. Not in the past, but in the present. On the morning of the fourth day, I found a ribbon. It was tied to a branch just off the trail, soft pink, like the breast cancer awareness kind. It fluttered slightly in the breeze. My breath caught. I stepped closer, touched the satin gently. It wasn't frayed. It was recently placed. I looked around, but the forest was still. I left it where it was, but I carried the moment with me. A few miles later, I found a perfectly balanced stack of stones beside a creek, deliberate and poetic. I smiled for the first time in days. It felt like someone or something was speaking in symbols. Or maybe I was just more awake now, more attuned to the whispers beneath the noise. I didn't feel lonely anymore. That night, I pitched my tent on a ridge with the view of the lake. The sunset painted the water in a molten orange and gold. I wrapped myself in my mother's old flannel and sat cross-legged on a boulder, feeling the air cool against my cheeks. I didn't cry, but I did feel something wet on my face, a tear or a breeze or both. "I miss you," I said softly. And then, without understanding why, I added, "I think I'm about to meet someone." The wind picked up, stirring the pine branches like breath, and somewhere, very faintly, I thought I heard her laugh. The trail grew quieter the deeper I went. By the 5th morning, I had crossed the invisible line between casual hikers and those who came to disappear for a while. The parking lots were hours behind me. No more families with kids in matching jackets. No more day trippers with earbuds in, checking their steps on their Apple Watches. Now it was just the wind in the birch trees and the occasional black-capped chickadee flitting across my path. My boots had softened to the rhythm of the trail. The ache in my legs was familiar now, almost meditative. I had stopped noticing the weight of my pack, and it had become an extension of me, like the grief I carried. Always there, always humming in the background. That morning, I broke camp with the slow, practiced movements. My fingers knew the knots now, the folds of the tent fabric, the way my stove sputtered before catching. I chewed a protein bar while the sun slowly spilled over the treetops, and the world was hushed and golden like it hadn't woken up yet. Before I started walking, I reached into the front pocket of my pack and pulled out her scarf, my mom's. Thin cotton, white with pale blue flowers. It was faded now, but still holding the faintest trace of her. Something soft like gardenias in old books. I tied it loosely around my neck and whispered, "Let's go." The forest was thick that day, dense with pine and aspen. The trail narrowed in places, forcing me to squeeze between leaning trunks and duck under fallen limbs. I liked the closeness. It felt like being held. The air smelled like sap and damp bark. Sunlight filtered in like stained glass. My boots made soft sounds in the pine needle-covered path. Somewhere nearby, water was trickling, a creek that I'd pass soon. I let my mind wander, because that was what it liked to do out here. It picked through memories like pebbles on a beach, turning them over, examining the smoothness or the sting. I thought about my mother. The last conversation that we had when she was lucid was 3 weeks before she died. She had asked me if I was happy. Not the polite kind of happy. Not the kind you perform when someone is checking in. She meant the deep, cellular kind. The kind that settles in your bones when you're in the right place with the right people, living in the right way. I hadn't known how to answer. I think I mumbled something about work, about how busy things had been. She had just nodded, too tired to press any further. But her eyes stayed on me for a long time, like she saw through every mask I wore. The truth was, I hadn't felt truly happy in years. Not since my mother's first diagnosis. Not since Jeff began pulling away, slowly like the tide at low moon. Not since I began carrying everything alone and pretending I wasn't breaking under it. Even when she was in remission and things looked normal again, I never found my way back to who I was before. I functioned, I smiled at meetings, I made sure to say happy birthday and hosted brunch, but I couldn't find joy. Not real joy. Not until the forest, not until this trail. A few hours into my hike, I came to a stream winding through the trees like a silver ribbon. A simple wooden footbridge crossed it, worn and creaking underfoot. I stopped in the center, leaning over the edge. The water was crystal clear, moving over rocks in smooth, hypnotic waves. I could see little tiny fish flickering in the shadows, tiny and quick, like thoughts I couldn't quite catch. I pulled off my pack and sat on the edge of the bridge, dangling my feet above the water. The silence was alive, not empty, full of movement and meaning. I closed my eyes and breathed in. I thought of the years I spent trying to keep everything together, the way I had ignored my own needs to be the good daughter, the strong one, the competent partner, the reliable friend. I thought of all the ways I had disappeared inside of my own life. And I whispered, without knowing why, I forgive you. Maybe I was talking to myself, maybe to my mother, maybe to God. The trail wound uphill after the stream, steep and twisting. I paused often to catch my breath, hands on my knees. But each time I looked back, the view stretched further. Forest in all directions, the lake glittering like a forgotten mirror in the distance. Around midday, I found a wide ledge with a view so spectacular I nearly dropped my pack. Below me, Lake Superior spread out endlessly. The color was unreal. An impossible turquoise near the shore, deepening to cobalt as it reached the horizon. Whitecaps danced like flecks of light. I sat on the edge, legs stretched out, letting the wind tangle my hair. There were no words for it, just the feeling of being so small and so infinite at the same time. I ate lunch there, just trail mix and a pouch of rehydrated couscous, but it tasted like a feast. I drank from my bottle and tilted my face to the sun, eyes closed. I imagined my mom sitting next to me, not as she was at the end, But as I remembered her when I was 10, healthy and laughing, wearing a red windbreaker and braiding my hair by the fire, I whispered, "You'd love this view." And then, I swear, a gust of wind swept in from nowhere and carried the scent of her favorite soap, lavender and lemon. It faded as fast as it came, but I smiled anyways. That night, I set up camp in a quiet grove near a patch of wild blueberries. I washed my hands in a nearby stream and watched the sky blush pink behind the trees. I thought of the city, of Edina's sidewalks and tidy rows of homes, of the restaurants where everyone wore neutral tones, and the grocery store where I used to pick up my mom's prescriptions. I couldn't picture myself going back. Not yet. Not with this still unfolding around me. As darkness fell, the forest transformed. The air cooled and the crickets began their high, rhythmic song. Fireflies blinked between the branches like tiny lanterns. I sat by my tiny campfire, just a few twigs for warmth and ritual, and opened the notebook I'd brought but hadn't touched. I wrote, "The silence here is not empty. It holds me, like I'm part of the story it's been telling for 1,000 years." I stared at that sentence for a long time, and then I wrote, "I think I'm being prepared for something." And under that, "Is it possible to meet someone who is always meant to find you?" The wind whispered in the trees that night. I lay in my tent, eyes open, watching the mesh roof fill with moonlight. My limbs ached in that satisfying way that told me I'd moved, stretched, and existed. I felt more alive than I had in a decade. And as I drifted off to sleep, I heard a voice, not in sound, but in sensation. "He's coming." A shiver ran down my spine, but I wasn't afraid. The next morning was silver and still. Dew clung to everything, leaves, my boots, the edge of my tent. I broke camp slowly, savoring the silence. My muscles protested as I hoisted my pack again, but I welcomed it. Each ache was proof that I was here, that I had chosen this, that I had survived something. I hiked through narrow ridges and past tall walls of pine. I crossed another stream and climbed over tangled roots, the ground damp and springy beneath my soles. And somewhere just ahead, I heard footsteps, heavy and steady and human. I paused, my heart thudding, not out of fear, but anticipation. For the first time on this entire journey, I wasn't alone on the trail. The footsteps stopped when I did. I stood still in the middle of the trail, one boot half planted in the dirt, listening. The forest held its breath. Wind rustled faintly through pine boughs overhead, but the distinct crunch of another pair of boots had gone silent. I waited. 5 seconds, 10. Then, just as I was convincing myself it was nothing, maybe even my own echo, he appeared. From around the curve in the trail, walking toward me, a man, alone, tall, broad-shouldered, a weathered pack on his back. I could see sweat darken to the collar of his shirt, and his forearms were sun-kissed and strong. He walked like someone who had been on the trail longer than I had, easy and sure-footed, like he knew the rhythm of the wilderness in his blood. He saw me and he slowed. I don't know why I expected something dramatic, like a gasp, a stumble, a moment ripped from a movie screen. But what had happened was simple. We nodded at each other. That's all. His eyes briefly met mine, gray-blue like the lake on an overcast day. And then he looked away, stepping to the side slightly so I could pass. I did the same. We were two strangers, each on our own path. But as I passed him, the air shifted. The space between us seemed to stretch and bend, like the air was thicker and denser with a humming sensation, like the forest was holding its breath for a different reason now. I turned after a few steps, just instinctively. So did he. We both laughed, kind of quiet and awkward, and I found myself speaking before I could overthink it. "Nice day," I said. My voice sounded scratchy and unused. He smiled, not just with his mouth, but something behind his eyes. "Best one yet," he replied. His voice was deeper than I expected, calm, like a song you didn't know you remembered until you heard it again. I stepped closer, though I didn't mean to. "How far have you come?" He shrugged. "Started near Judge C.R. Magny, headed south. You?" "Gooseberry Falls," I said, "northbound." We were going opposite directions. Of course we were. He gestured toward a nearby clearing off the trail. "You resting?" I hesitated. My body wasn't screaming for a break yet, but my heart was already leaning in his direction. "I could be," I said. We sat on a large flat rock beneath the pines. The canopy overhead filtered the sunlight into thin strips, creating shifting patterns on the forest floor. I pulled out my water bottle and he did the same. Neither of us spoke right away, and somehow it didn't feel strange. Eventually, he offered me some dried mango from a little cloth pouch. I took a piece, chewing slowly. The sweetness filled my mouth. It was the best thing I'd tasted in days. "I'm Evan," he said finally. It took me a moment to realize that he was offering more than his name. He was anchoring this moment, marking it. I swallowed. "Lena." He smiled again, and this time a little softer. "Hi, Lena." "Hi." We talked in low voices for a while, the kind you use when you're inside something sacred and didn't want to break the spell. He told me he was from northern Wisconsin, grew up fishing with his grandfather, knew the shape of the lake like the back of his hand. He worked in outdoor education. He took groups of teens on wilderness retreats in the summer. He said it with such humility, like it wasn't a big deal. I told him I was from Medina and this was my first long hike. He looked impressed, not in a patronizing way. "You picked a good one," he said. I shrugged. Didn't really pick it. It kind of called me. His eyes flicked to mine. "Yeah," he said, "me too." It grew quiet again. A woodpecker tapped somewhere in the distance. Pine needles whispered overhead. I asked him why he was hiking alone, and he looked down for a moment, rubbing his palms together. "My brother passed away last winter. He always said he wanted to do this trail and never got the chance." I felt the words in my chest, so familiar and heavy. "I'm sorry," I said. He nodded. "Me too." There was a pause. I looked at the sky through the trees. "My mom passed away in February," I said. "Cancer." I didn't cry, but my voice wavered. Evan didn't say anything right away. He just reached into his pack and handed me a small folded handkerchief. Blue and white plaid, soft and worn. It was such a gentle thing. I held it for a second before wiping my eyes. "Thank you," I said. He gave a slow nod. We don't talk about loss enough, not out loud. We sat together for what could have been minutes or an hour. I didn't check. Time felt fluid around him, or maybe just irrelevant. He was calm, but not closed, still, but alive. Like he knew how to sit inside a moment without trying to fix it. That alone made him feel like someone from another world. I wondered what he saw when he looked at me. Did I look like someone healing? Or someone unraveling? I didn't ask. Instead, I said, "I've barely seen anyone out here." He smiled. "You're the first person I've talked to in days." The silence that followed was warm and charged. I noticed the faint stubble along his jaw, the way the sun caught the curve of his cheekbone. His hands were broad and strong and marked with dirt and tiny scars. I felt my pulse in my throat. "I should keep moving," I said eventually, even though I didn't mean it. He nodded slow. "Yeah, me too." We stood up together, brushing pine needles off of our pants. He looked down the trail the way he'd come, and I looked the opposite way. Opposite paths. I adjusted my straps, and he did too. We didn't move. Instead, I looked up at him and I said, "Do you believe in soulmates?" It slipped out before I could catch it. He looked surprised, but not dismissive. "I don't know," he said. "I used to think it was just a poetic idea, but lately..." He looked around at the trees, the sky, and me. "I think we're all just walking around half asleep until something wakes us up." I held his gaze. "And what if you meet the right person, but it's the wrong time?" He took a deep breath. "Then you love them anyway, even if it's just for a moment." Something broke open in me then, a dam I hadn't known was still standing. I stepped forward, and he did too. And in that tiny sliver of space, we met, his forehead resting against mine, breath mingling. No kiss, not yet, just presence and gravity. We stood like that, eyes closed, breathing together. His hand came up, brushing the scarf at my neck. He ran his thumb gently over the fabric. "This is beautiful," he whispered. "It was hers," I said. He nodded like he already knew. "I don't know what this is," I whispered, "but I know I'll remember it." He smiled, eyes still closed. "Some things aren't meant to last, just to change you." I didn't want to leave, and neither did he. But the trail, like life, doesn't let you linger forever. We walked together for a while in silence, just side by side, not touching, just matching steps, breath between footsteps. Every now and then we'd glance at each other and smile, like two kids sharing a secret no one else would understand. At a small clearing where the trail split briefly around a boulder, he stopped. "This is where I turn," he said. My throat tightened. I didn't want to say goodbye. I also knew I had to. We stood for a long time, not speaking. Then he took my hand, just for a second, and placed something small in my palm. A polished piece of driftwood, worn smooth and heart-shaped. I found it near Grand Marais, and I was saving it. Now I know what for. My eyes burned. "Thank you." He leaned in, finally, and kissed me. He wasn't hurried, not tentative, just full and certain, like we've done it 1,000 times before. When he pulled back, he whispered, "Sometimes soulmates only pass through." Then he turned and walked away. I stood there long after he vanished into the trees. And when I started walking again, my chest was lighter, but my soul had been touched, like I was marked and awake. I didn't walk far after he'd left. My feet kept moving, but my mind stayed rooted in that clearing, under the tall pines, where his kiss still lingered on my lips like warmth in winter. Every step felt strange, not difficult, but weightless, as if I had shed something invisible or gained something I didn't understand. I must have turned around at least 5 times in that first hour, half expecting to see him walking back toward me, but the path stayed empty. No voices, no footsteps, just the hum of the forest and my own breath echoing louder than usual. Still, I didn't feel alone. I felt watched, but gently, as if the trees themselves were holding memory of him for me. The trail dipped and rose through groves of aspen and fields of wild ferns. I passed a moss-covered rock that looked like a sleeping bear and crossed a wooden footbridge lined with feathers, blue jay, crow, and one brilliant red streak that might have belonged to a cardinal. I found myself reaching into my pocket again and again to touch the driftwood heart. I didn't even need to try to explain the moment to myself. I didn't ask how a stranger could feel so familiar, how one conversation could unlock parts of me that had been sealed for years, how a kiss in the woods could feel like a memory instead of something new. It wasn't logical. It wasn't even comfortable, but it was true. Whatever that was between us was real. I set up camp that evening near a secluded stream where the water sounded like distant music. The sky was streaked with lavender and peach, and the moon hung low like a promise not yet made. I built a small fire and sat cross-legged beside it, the driftwood heart in one hand, my journal in the other. I didn't write about what I thought I would, not about Evan, not directly. Instead, I wrote, "Some people arrive like seasons, meant to change the landscape, but not stay in it. And underneath that, I didn't imagine him." And one final line, "The lake knows what it keeps." That night, I dreamt vividly. I was walking through the forest barefoot, the earth warm beneath my feet. The trees whispered in a language I couldn't understand, and the stars blinked above like ancient eyes. I came to a meadow full of wildflowers that glowed faintly in the dark. And there he was, Evan, sitting cross-legged in the middle of it all, palms upturned and eyes closed. I knelt beside him. He didn't open his eyes, but he did speak. "I will find you again." Then I woke up, heart pounding. The forest around me was still. The moonlight poured through the mesh roof of my tent like milk. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once, long and slow. I whispered back, "Okay." I hiked slower the next day, not because I was tired, but because everything felt different. like the forest had become more alive, more sacred, more enchanted. I noticed everything: the curve of the lichen on fallen logs, the deep rust color of pine needles layered like time on the ground, the way the wind shifted before I crested each hill. I no longer felt like a visitor. I felt like I belonged here, like I'd always belonged here. Around midday, I reached a ridge with a panoramic view of the lake. I dropped my pack and stood in silence. Lake Superior stretched to the edge of the world, shimmering under the sun. The wind rolled off the water and braided itself through my hair. Gulls cried overhead. I held the heart-shaped driftwood in my hand. "He kissed me here," I whispered, as if the wind might carry the words back to him. I sat and ate lunch: peanut butter on a tortilla, a handful of almonds, a chocolate square that had melted in my palm. And I thought about all the ways a heart can open. Sometimes it takes years: therapy, grief, letting go. Sometimes it takes one look from a stranger in the woods. I resumed my hike and found myself whispering stories to the trees. Not the kind of stories I'd tell anyone else, not even a therapist. These were raw things: old aches, shame, dreams I thought I had lost. I talked about how I used to draw floor plans in my notebooks as a kid and wanted to be an architect like my mom. How I buried that dream after she got sick and just took a job that paid the bills. I told the trees about Jeff, how he left when I needed him the most, how I pretended it didn't hurt, how I started to believe I was too much for people to carry. And I told them about Evan, about his presence calmed something in me that had been screaming for years. The trees didn't interrupt, and they didn't try to fix anything. They just listened. Later, near dusk, I came to a clearing ringed with wild daisies. At the center stood a single tall pine, its branches sweeping the sky, its bark scarred with age. I felt drawn to it. I stepped closer and placed my hand against the trunk, warm and solid, buzzing with quiet life. Without thinking, I knelt and pressed the driftwood heart against its roots. "Keep this," I whispered. "Keep him." Then I stood and walked away, leaving the token there like an offering. That night, I camped near Lake Inlet, the sound of water lapping against the rocks like a lullaby. I brewed tea from a pouch of dried mint, stared at the flames of my tiny fire until they blurred into stars. I wondered where Evan was, if he'd dreamed of me too. I wondered if I'd ever see him again. But I didn't ache with longing. I didn't feel hollow or desperate. what I felt was full. Like I had been given something that didn't need to be held to be real. Like the spark between us had already done its work. In the morning, I woke to a light rain. Mist clung to the edges of the leaves like silver threads. I packed slowly, not in a hurry to leave this part of the trail. As I slung my pack onto my shoulders, I heard a rustle behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. Just the sound of wind moving through the pines. Still, I smiled. I whispered, "I know you're still with me." And I started walking. The forest was drenched in morning mist. Every leaf held a drop. The ferns bent under dew. The soil beneath my boots felt soft and generous, as if it was waiting to hold me. I had walked nearly an hour before I realized I hadn't thought once of time. No glances at the position of the sun, no internal calendar ticking off days. There was only this, each breath, each step, each rise and fall of the land beneath me. The rhythm had become sacred. And Evan, he had become something more than a memory, not quite a dream, a vibration just below the surface of everything. I paused by a spruce tree split by lightning long ago, its charred core now softened by moss. I placed my palm against the bark and closed my eyes. The forest pulsed gently beneath me, like a slow heartbeat. I could still feel him in my chest, not as pain, not even as absence, but as presence, as if the trail itself remembered him, as if the trees carried some version of us in their rings. I came to a section of the trail where the canopy thinned and a high overlook opened out over the lake. The sky was still heavy with clouds, casting the water in muted blues and silvers. I sat on a smooth slab of granite, legs dangling over the ledge. I pulled out my notebook. I had stopped trying to narrate the trip, to document it like a reporter. Now I wrote only to feel. I wrote, "There's something sacred about not needing to be understood." I didn't imagine him. The wind still speaks in his voice. From my perch, I watched a pair of loons glide across the inlet far below. They called once, an eerie, melodic wail that echoed up the cliffside and landed in my ribs like a lullaby from another lifetime. It reminded me of the sound Evan made when he laughed softly at something I had said. Like he wasn't laughing at the joke, but at how familiar I already felt to him. I stayed there longer than I meant to. Eventually, hunger tugged me back toward the trail. I dug out a crushed granola bar and walked with it in hand, letting crumbs fall carelessly into the path. Birds flitted between branches above. Squirrels chattered somewhere out of sight. A fox crossed ahead of me once, silent and ginger-colored, vanishing into the brush like smoke. The forest was a cathedral, and I moved through it with reverence. Around midday, I reached a fork in the trail, marked by a faded wooden signpost. The left path led to a small spur trail down to a lake I had read about in a hiker's guide. A quiet, off-map spot perfect for a break. So I took it. The descent was steep and damp, winding through dense undergrowth and sharp outcroppings of rock. I slipped once and caught myself with a palm against the earth. It left a streak of mud along my wrist I didn't wipe off. I came to a wide open clearing that hugged the shore of a glassy lake. There were no other footprints, no sign of recent campers. It was perfect. I dropped my pack under a white pine and sat along the water's edge, pulling off my boots. I dipped my feet in slowly, cool, almost sharp against my skin. But the pain passed quickly, replaced by a thrilling kind of aliveness. I rolled up my pant legs and waded up to my calves. The water was so clear I could see every pebble. Tiny minnows darted past. The dragonfly hovered near my shoulder. I closed my eyes and tilted my face to the sky. I don't know how long I stood there, but when my eyes opened, I half expected to see him. Not in a rational way, in the way you expect an old friend to walk around the corner after you just remembered their name. I didn't see him, but I did feel watched. The hair on my arms stood up, not from fear, from awareness. I turned slowly. The forest was quiet behind me, but there, resting on a log near my pack, was a small stack of stones. 5 of them, perfectly balanced. I hadn't built it, and I had been alone. My heart thrummed. I walked to the log and stared at the cairn. Each stone was different, flat, round, speckled, dark. They didn't belong together, but they had been made to, like 2 hikers who crossed paths on opposite journeys. I sat beside it, unsure what to do. Then I smiled. "Okay," I whispered. "I see you." That night, I camped near the lake, lulled by the gentle rhythm of the waves against the shore. I made lentils and drank peppermint tea and wrote in my notebook. Some moments follow you. Some leave stones behind. He is both. I dreamt again. This time, I was back at the overlook, the one where we first talked, but the forest was glowing, lit from within by something golden and warm. Evan stood at the edge, barefoot and smiling. He held a pine branch in one hand and extended it towards me. When I took it, it turned into a key. I asked, "To what?" He just said, "To what comes next." and I woke with the sound of loons echoing across the water. The next morning, I walked with purpose, not to chase him, not even to find another sign, but because I felt guided now, like I was on a pilgrimage to somewhere I didn't need to name. The trail rose and fell in long, slow waves. The sun peeked out around noon, painting the moss bright green and turning the leaves translucent. I found a fallen tree and sat for lunch, legs stretched out. I hummed a song that I hadn't heard since childhood. Halfway through, I realized it was one my mother used to hum while brushing my hair. Grief, I've learned, doesn't just recede. It changes shape. It goes from sharp and sudden to soft and steady, like the background hum of a forest full of memory. Some days it's a thunderclap. Other days it's a pine cone at your feet that reminds you of the person who taught you to climb trees. On that trail between the trees, my grief softened. Because I was not alone. Because he had found me. And somehow it was enough. By the end of the day, I reached a campsite tucked between a ridge and a river. I built a fire and boiled water for pasta. As the flames flickered and the stars came out one by one, I remembered something Evan had said. Some soulmates only pass through. And I wondered, what if some soulmates don't come to stay? What if they could come to awaken, to remind us that we're still alive, to pull the sleeping parts of us back into the light? I slept deeply that night, no dreams, just warmth. The morning of my final hike began with fog so thick it wrapped the forest in silence. I unzipped my tent slowly, blinking into the pale gray air. Trees rose like ghosts in every direction, their tops vanishing into the mist. My breath clouded in front of me, curling upward and joining the hush. There is something sacred about that kind of quiet, when sound itself seemed to pause. The forest was breathing, and I didn't want to interrupt it. I lit my little stove without a word and poured water into my mug, adding a peppermint tea bag and holding it between my palms like an offering. My fingers trembled, not from cold, but from anticipation. I didn't know what I was expecting. I only knew that something was waiting. Today was my last full day on the trail, and part of me didn't want to leave. I packed slowly, folding each piece of gear with care, as if imprinting memory into every strap, every pocket. When I cinched the top of my pack closed, I ran my hand over it and whispered, "Thank you." Not just to the gear, but to the journey, to the days I had walked alone, to the land that had carried me, taught me, steadied me. I stood for a long while before setting off, looking back at the site where I had slept. My tent had left a soft impression on the ground, a temporary mark, like I had been there, but never meant to stay. I adjusted the scarf around my neck, my mother's. The cotton felt lighter than usual, as if warmed by memory. And then I started walking. The mist made everything feel dreamlike. Trees emerged only when I was close enough to touch them. Bird song was muffled. Even my footsteps seemed quieter, like the forest was absorbing the sound. I hiked slowly, letting each moment settle. There was no rush now, no final destination that mattered more than the in-between. As I climbed the ridge, the fog began to lift in pieces, first revealing branches above, then the trail ahead, then shafts of light cutting through like stained glass. Sunlight warmed my cheeks. My breath had slowed. And then, around a bend in the trail, I saw him. Evan. He stood facing the lake, just beyond the curve where the trail split above a wide birch. His back was to me. He hadn't heard my steps. But I had known somehow I would see him again. His presence didn't surprise me. It completed something. I stopped walking, watching him from a short distance, allowing myself the gift of that moment. His silhouette against the water, the curve of his shoulders, the way his body held stillness like it belonged to the land. After a few seconds, he turned. Our eyes met, and neither of us moved. Then he smiled, and I exhaled. We didn't speak at first. He waited until I reached him, until we stood less than a foot apart. I began, and then stopped. He tilted his head. Me too. We stood there, the lake stretching out behind him, glittering like memory. I wasn't sure you were real, I whispered. He reached forward and gently touched the scarf at my neck. I wondered the same about you. We sat together beneath the birch, backs against its smooth bark, the lake in full view. The fog had burned off entirely, and the air shimmered with warmth. The scent of pine, sun-warmed earth, and river rock surrounded us. Neither of us asked why we were both there again. We didn't need to. We talked instead about the days since we'd met. He told me about the dream he had of me sitting in the middle of a field surrounded by fireflies. I told him about the cairn someone had left by my pack. Not someone, he said gently. I looked at him. He smiled, a little sheepish. I was there for a minute. You were asleep. My eyes filled before I could stop them. Why didn't you wake me? He looked away, out over the water. Because you looked free, and because I didn't know if I could say goodbye again. We spent the afternoon walking together, not fast, just a slow, winding pace through a section of trail rich with color and sound. Bluebells bloomed in pockets. A bald eagle flew overhead. We stopped often at a stream, at a ridge, by a tree shaped like a tuning fork. Sometimes we spoke. Sometimes we just breathed beside each other. At one point, he reached for my hand. I let him take it. His palm was warm and familiar. Our fingers fit as if they had done this in another life. We stopped for lunch on a flat rock ledge that jutted out over a deep valley. We ate slowly, our almonds and apple slices, dried cheddar. He gave me half of his last chocolate square. It melted on my tongue, bittersweet and soft. When we were done, I leaned against him. His arms wrapped around my shoulder without hesitation. And for a while, we said nothing, just existed together. But as the light shifted and shadows lengthened, a quiet began to settle between us. Not the comfortable silence of earlier. This one carried weight. We both knew time was folding in on itself. He walked me to a fork in the trail, one I hadn't noticed on my map. "This heads back inland," he said softly. "It's where I leave you." The air changed. The sun seemed to dim. I looked down the path and back at him. "Where does it go?" I asked, though the question wasn't really about the trail. He shrugged. "Somewhere else." We stood there, the way people stand before boarding different trains. He held my gaze. "I want to stay," I said quietly. He smiled. It was beautiful, sad and full and bright. "I know." He took my hands in his and held them tightly. But this was never about staying for either of us. A breeze swept through the clearing, rustled leaves brushing my cheek like a whisper. I wanted to protest, to ask for more, one more night, one more hour. But something in his eyes stopped me. This was already more than most people ever get. He leaned forward and kissed me, slower than the first time. It was deeper and lingering. When he pulled back, I rested my forehead against his. "I don't want to forget," I whispered. "You won't." He reached into his pack and pulled out a small pine cone, perfectly symmetrical, just beginning to open. "For the next time, you need to remember the forest," he said. I clutched it to my chest. "I'll find you again," I said, echoing the dream. He smiled faintly. "You already have." Then he stepped away, down the forked trail, and vanished into the trees without looking back. I stayed frozen for a long time, not crying and not breaking, just feeling everything. Eventually, I turned and continued on. I walked until the sun dipped low, until the shadows lengthened like memories behind me, until the trail curved once more into a familiar rhythm. And as I walked, I whispered to the wind, Some love doesn't ask you to stay, it just asks to be remembered. That night, I camped alone beneath the stars. No fire, no tea, just silence, and a pine cone beside my pillow. In the morning, I woke before dawn. The world was still blue and folded in sleep. I packed up and began my final descent. As the forest opened into the edge of the trailhead and my car came into view, I paused. I turned once more to the trees behind me. The wind moved through them gently, carrying something that I could no longer name. When I opened my glove box to retrieve my keys, a folded scrap of paper fell out. My breath caught. It wasn't mine. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. 4 words, handwritten in steady, slanted print. The forest remembers you. I didn't return to Edina all at once. I drove slowly after leaving the trailhead, windows cracked to let in the scent of pine and lake air, and the scarf around my neck fluttering slightly with each gust. My thighs were sore. My hands still smelled faintly of smoke and earth. There were burrs caught in my shoelaces, and a soft ache behind my eyes that no longer felt like grief. It felt like gratitude. I stopped in Duluth for the night, checking into a small motel with lake views and a chipping blue door. I took the longest shower of my life and sat wrapped in a towel at the edge of the bed, staring out at the water. The lake had followed me, or maybe I had never left it. In the morning, I drove the rest of the way home without turning on the radio. The silence felt like an old friend now, full and patient and awake. My house had that faint, closed-up smell, like a room that had forgotten how to breathe. I opened all the windows. I stood barefoot in my kitchen, blinking under the fluorescent light, wondering how I'd ever mistaken this space for the whole world. My inbox had filled. My phone had messages from coworkers, neighbors, and ex-friend from college who had just checked in without really saying anything. I didn't answer any of them, not that day. I made tea instead. I sat at the kitchen table with my journal open, my pine cone resting in a dish beside me, and wrote, "The world is still here, but I've changed how I enter it." In the days that followed, I moved through Edina like someone reborn into a familiar dream. I returned to the office, but everything felt quieter there. The stress bounced off me now instead of sinking in. I had lunch with my neighbor, Miss Loring, and listened as she talked about her garden, her cat, the new tenant down the block. She paused once and looked at me thoughtfully. "You're different," she said. I smiled, like, "Good different?" She nodded slowly. "You're softer, but stronger too." I cleaned out my mother's room on the fourth day back, not because I had to, but because I was ready. I opened the closet and let my fingers trail across her old cardigans, her stack of linen scarves, the dusty cedar sachets she used to tuck between folded sweaters. I found her hiking boots, still laced, still worn in all the places that told the story of her. I held them against my chest and I wept. But it wasn't the breaking kind of cry. It was the remembering kind. That night, I walked to the edge of Centennial Lakes Park and sat on the bench facing the water. Not Lake Superior, but it moved gently, and that was enough. I imagined Evan sitting beside me. I imagined telling him how I'd been, how I had started sketching again, rough outlines of trails and trees, cabins nestled in ravines, the shape of his hand holding mine. How I'd gone to the co-op and bought loose-leaf peppermint tea and kept it in a mason jar on my counter. How I'd started leaving my phone off for hours each day, not out of protest, but because I no longer needed its hum to fill the silence. I imagined him smiling. Sometimes I caught glimpses of him. Not really, but almost. A man walking out of a bookstore, same gait. A stranger in a coffee shop with the same curve to his shoulders. A voice in a crowd that sounded like his laugh. Each time my chest tightened, but never with pain. It was more like wonder that something so brief could root itself so deeply. I began writing again, not just in the journal, but essays, letters I'd never send, a piece I submitted to an online magazine about grief and how healing isn't always loud or grand. Sometimes healing is just eating trail mix beside a stranger with kind eyes and letting the trees carry your story for a while. The editor wrote back 2 weeks later and they wanted to publish it. On a Sunday afternoon, I drove north again, just to Two Harbors. I didn't hike, just stood at the shoreline and let the wind tangle my hair. I brought the scarf and I wore her boots. I left the pine cone on a flat rock near the water and whispered, "I'll be back." And I believed it. I never heard from Evan again, but I didn't expect to. We had never exchanged numbers, no last names, not even a proper goodbye. It was intentional, sacred. We had given each other a chapter, not a sequel. And some stories are meant to end quietly, but echo forever. Now, on nights when I cannot sleep, I open the window and let the breeze carry the scent of pine into my room. I press my hand into my chest and feel the steady rhythm beneath my ribs. I walk the trail in my dreams. He's always there, sometimes beside me, sometimes just ahead, turning around to smile. Sometimes I wake with his name on my lips, even though I've never said it aloud in months. And I whisper into the dark, I remember. Because I do. I remember the scarf and the fireflies in my dreams. I remember his voice saying, "Some soulmates only pass through." And I remember the note, folded like a secret in my glove box. "The forest remembers you." So I write, and I walk, and I listen to the wind when it brushes against my cheek in the middle of the day, as if it's reaching out to remind me, you were loved, you were seen, and you are not alone. It's late September. The leaves are just starting to change, edges tinged with amber and rust. The air smells like cedar and wood smoke, and I've started carrying my mother's scarf again, even though it's only cool enough just to need it. I've returned to the trail. Not the full stretch this time, just a weekend hike. A section near Cascade River that I never explored last year. It felt like time. Not to chase the past, but to meet myself again. I hike lighter now. A smaller pack and fewer expectations. I don't count miles or measure time. I listen to chickadees calling across the ravine, to the sound of my boots on packed soil, to the quiet rhythm inside me that still remembers how to follow the trees. I pass a couple with matching walking sticks. We exchange brief smiles and I let them go ahead. I stop beside a tall pine and press my palm against the bark. It doesn't answer, not in words, but it knows me. The way the wind moves around my shoulders, the way the light settles just across my face. It remembers. Near dusk, I find a spot to camp, halfway up a ridge, where the view stretches wide and the trees thin just enough to see the sky bloom into lavender. I build a fire, I brew tea, and I sit, just as I did then. I reach into my pack, not even thinking, and pull out a fresh notebook. The pages are blank except for one. I had forgotten it was in here. On the inside cover, in my own handwriting, is a single sentence. I will carry what the forest gave me. I run my fingers over the words, and then, with the light fading, I begin to write again. I don't write about Evan directly, not yet. Instead, I write about a breeze that carries memory, a pine cone offered as a promise, a clearing where hearts touched just long enough to remember what it meant to feel fully awake. I fall asleep to the sound of wind moving through treetops, and in the space between waking and a dream, I hear a voice, low and familiar. You're still walking, it says. And I whisper back, so are you. Somewhere far off, an owl calls into the night, and I smile, even in sleep, because I know he hears it too, wherever he is.